COVID anniversary webinar. We're glad to see people happy and healthy and back to whatever this normal thing is. So we have a lot to cover today. Tim is going to speak to us about the idea of making vaccines mandatory for our staff people. Nuala is going to tell you about COVID compliance officers, an idea that we've come up with to make sure that your workplace is safe. Then Nuala and I are going to have a discussion about community leadership and opportunities that the crisis has presented for us. And then Mia will finish with her tips, tricks, and reminders for your municipality. So we're going to do that. But first, Mia and Nuala have a very important announcement for everybody. So I'm going to hand it over to Nuala and Mia. Who are muted.
You missed the whole song. We were muted. We just sang it in opera and everything. Happy birthday, Peggy Griffo.
Happy birthday, Peggy.
You're a queen that lives in Prince.
Happy birthday, Peggy. I'm sad that I can't see your face right now.
You're not missing anything. She's just upset.
Okay, well, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tim to talk about mandatory vaccines and mandatory vaccine policies. And like with our other webinars, we're happy to take questions. You can put them into the chat and we'll get to the questions that that we can. And if we can't get to them, then we'll touch base with you after the webinar. So please don't hesitate with the questions. So over to you, Tim. Tell us about vaccines and why we should get vaccinated.
Unmute myself. Happy birthday, Peggy, and thanks everyone for joining us. Mandatory vaccines have become a fairly hot topic. It's something that a lot of employers are considering implementing, and there's a lot of considerations around whether or not you ought to, even if you can in fact impose a mandatory vaccination policy. And I actually have some. I'm just going to see if I can possibly share my screen because I have some slides that I can go through with everyone. I just want to see if I can share my screen, and bear with me for a second here, everyone.
I'll give you the capability, just 1 second. You should be good now.
Okay, perfect. Now I'm just trying to figure out how to actually do it, but as I'm trying to figure out how to share my screen, everyone, the crux where the idea for mandatory vaccines comes from is the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and the idea that and I apologize, guys, Britt is here helping me figure out how to do this. Yeah, or just right here, Britt. Yeah. Okay, can everybody see the slides that are on the screen presently?
Yeah, we can, Tim.
Okay, perfect. So thanks everyone. Thanks for bearing with me. Technologically challenged on this end, but Occupational Health and Safety Act grants, it mandates that employers protect workers, and the idea of this is captured in section 25 sub 2. It says basically that an employer has a duty to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of a worker. And the question becomes, is mandatory vaccination part of the discharge of that duty? Employees, on the flip side, have the right to refuse unsafe work. There have been hundreds, I believe, last time I checked, there were hundreds of work refusals for various reasons related to COVID. I believe only one was upheld. And what the Ontario government has actually said with respect to the right to refuse work is an employer not following the guidelines the guidelines established is not sufficient to ground a right to refuse unsafe work. It may be possible if an employee at the workplace positive for COVID-19, but the Ontario government said we're not going to essentially just other employees or the employer failing to follow the guidelines is not necessarily sufficient to refuse to ground a right to refuse unsafe work. There are some examples. There's no legislation presently that mandates COVID-19 vaccination, but it's not without precedent. There are regulations, for example, under Ontario's Child Care and Early Years Act, Long-Term Care Homes Act, and the Ambulance Act, and there's some requirements under the Food and Drug regulations as well for vaccination, but these are not related necessarily to COVID-19. All of the case law thus far on mandatory vaccination policies comes from the healthcare sector, and in particular unionized workplaces. And what has essentially happened is they're of limited value because they very much depend on the language of the collective agreement at issue. And also, at the time, much of the discussion in the cases was around the scientific evidence for the flu, the vaccination against influenza. And so there was conflicting evidence at the time about whether or not the vaccinations were an adequate measure to prevent the spread of influenza. And so a lot of these cases, essentially, I believe there were a few that were upheld. They really do go either way with respect to whether they would uphold a vaccine or mask policy in respect of influenza. And remember, they were all in the healthcare sector. And so they really are of limited use. And so that leaves us at best trying to use an educated guess as to what a court would find if an employer actually did try and mandate vaccination for COVID-19. Of course, an employer is going to try and have 100% vaccination under a policy. That's going to be a lofty goal. There are going to be people who are unable for various reasons to get the vaccination. There may be disabilities involved. There may be religious issues involved, and so there's protected grounds under human rights legislation. And employees who have those issues will have to be accommodated. So some of the considerations that we've put together with respect to whether you're a unionized or non-unionized workplace, policies must be consistent with employees' employment agreements or the collective agreement. It's got to be reasonable. It has to be clear and unequivocal. It has to provide, it has to be brought to the attention of employees affected before the employer acts on it. It has to be consistent. It has to provide, or I should say, we're recommending that it provide non-disciplinary alternatives to vaccination. Alternatives being remote working, which we've all done, allowing non-vaccinated employees to go on unpaid leave of absences when the risk of workplace transmission is particularly high. So these are some general considerations for mandatory vaccination policies. Privacy is, of course, a big issue with these. The employee's medical information is considered part of personal information, and in fact, disclosure of medical information about an employee is considered is presumptively an unjustified invasion of privacy under MFIPA. And so we have to be very careful, and I've geared my comments towards our municipal clients. Of course, many workplaces are governed by PIPEDA, but what we recommend is that policies state why they're being required, why employees are required to have mandatory vaccines, why the information about their vaccination status is being collected, what information is going to be collected, how that information is going to be stored, a statement about the confidentiality and disclosure of the information. One of the recommendations out of Saskatchewan, the Information and Privacy Commissioner there, has looked at this issue and said, really what employers should do is strive to, if they're going to share this information, should de-identify it and share it as statistical information. So percentage of employees who have gotten vaccinated, for example, and a statement about how the information will be disposed of or destroyed once it's no longer needed. That's a very quick overview of what we've come up with respect to mandatory vaccination. And I'm sure there are lots of questions, and I'm going to open my chat window, but I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has about that before we move on.
So Tim, a couple of questions. I'm not sure, are you familiar with the idea of the vaccination passport?
Yes, yeah, and in what the idea, one thing that businesses are considering as well is whether to permit, I've heard some businesses ask the question, can I require proof of a client's vaccination status to actually let a customer or a client enter my facility? And that's a question that's I actually don't have a solid answer to at the moment, but what did you think about with respect to the immunity passport, Paul?
Well, I was speaking with Nuala about it, and we were thinking that probably you're going to see requirements for proof of vaccination where we had typical gatherings. So to get into a concert, to get into a sporting event. I think you're going to see it needed to cross the border. So I think that is an area that's going to develop, and I'm predicting that we're going to see a bit of a lessening of privacy rights in favor of protecting the collective by being able to require proof of vaccination. So I think that's coming.
And I actually think that an employer can require evidence of employee vaccinations. It's really about what they do with that information once it's in their possession. Especially under MFIPA, there's restrictions on disclosure of personal information. And as I say, medical information, which I believe COVID vaccination proof would likely fall under, disclosure of that is presumed to be an unjustified invasion of privacy. And so there are other, as Paul said, there are other competing interests at play, and we've certainly seen public safety trump many other considerations as we've gone through the learning process with COVID. So it's on the table, certainly, and definitely I think for border crossings, because as we know, passage into the United States, for example, it is not a right; it's a privilege, as they say at the border, and so they certainly could require Canadians to prove vaccination status.
Nuala, I got a question for you on this, and that is, what do you do? What are your thoughts about what you do with employees who are resistant to getting the vaccine?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Nice to see everyone again. As Paul said, we are just delighted to be joining you again on the 1-year anniversary of the pandemic. And we were saying, you know, I think in my entire life, I don't think I ever used the word pandemic until last year. So when we started using it. So now it's a word we'll never forget, but it's great to have the group again together today. I think you are going to see resistance, Paul. I think we saw it every step of the way with the pandemic and the precautions. We saw people that didn't want to wear masks, that didn't want to wear masks for legitimate health reasons, and then people just didn't want to wear masks because of the independence. I think that we are grown so familiar with in a democracy that people really, become resentful of that. So, I mean, people are going to have different approaches. Health and safety has to trump. But I know a lot of people that are very committed to a holistic lifestyle, and I can't see them changing that. And there is a view that in the interest of my health and safety, I am not taking the vaccine. I know that is a strongly held view. And I think now when so many people are excited at the prospect of the vaccine really containing the virus and life getting back to more of a normal than what we have now, Paul, like what you were saying, the new normal. No, the old normal. You know, people are anxious to go back to the old normal. I think with that enthusiasm, that a lot of people that are opposed to the vaccine are just being very quiet about it for fear of bullying or intellectual intimidation or whatever. So my approach always is through knowledge. I think it's very important to link arms with local public health units. They're the experts. I'm a big believer in, deferring to expertise in whatever field, rather than being sort of an every person that knows everything. Of course you couldn't. So in this sort of communicable pandemic, disease, and vaccinations, our public health units are the experts. And it's important, I think, to get right information. You guys will recall at the beginning of this when then President Trump was saying that you could inject, goodness, I can't remember what it was, Lysol or something. And then later, I think he said that was tongue in cheek. But again, the sources of information, it's very important if people are opposed to vaccine to use credible sources, even credible holistic sources or whatever you choose, but not just, my buddy said, this is a longer answer, I think, than Paul wanted, so I'm going to wrap it up, but I want to share with everybody this. I just shared it with Paul this morning. I was dealing with a mechanic that I deal with a lot, and his father is he's 1,000 years old if he's a day. He's the oldest guy I've ever seen, but he still works in the shop. He constantly smells like cigarette smoke. One time, my car was in the shop, and I had to borrow the father's car as a loaner for the day, and it was unbearable. It was absolutely unbearable. I thought I had lung cancer just driving around. So I saw the father, and I said, "Hey, your boy said you quit smoking." "I don't quit smoke." Said, "Oh, you're still smoking?" "Yeah, I don't smoke too much." I said, "You do smoke too much. I borrowed your vehicle. Your vehicle smokes too much." And I said to him, "Are you going to get the vaccine?" He says, No, I don't get the vaccine." And I said, "You're not going to get the vaccine? Why not?" "I don't know what's in it." "Do you know what's in a cigarette? Do you have any idea what's in a cigarette?" I mean, so there's very, he's just holding on to that, I think, because he hears it in the shop that people say, "I don't know what's in that vaccine. I don't know." And I mean, maybe that's a legitimate concern. Then find out what's in it. Do a little bit of research. So my urge to people that are opposed to getting the vaccine, especially if you're in a workplace that wants your staff vaccinated, I'm with Paul for certain 100%. Voluntary things like sporting events, travel, that's going to be a mandatory vaccine. It'll just be the easiest way to manage it. I was reading that Royal Caribbean, I think, is sailing in June with all vaccinated passengers and staff. So I think that's the way it's going to go. If you're trying to urge people, I would say follow the experts. In this case, that's local health units, and read legitimate sources, not just scuttlebutt. So very long-winded answer for you there, Paul.
No, but I appreciate that, Nuala, and I think that the concept of approaching it with information and compassion, rather than just jumping up and down and saying you're wrong, is probably a more effective approach. And I had two pretty profound statements from somebody who was teaching us about vaccines, and she said, "Remember, the vaccine is trying to help you, and the virus is trying to kill you." Which was very poignant, I thought. And she also said, if you're thinking about the long-term effects of the vaccine, compare those with the long-term effects of the virus. And I think that's a very wise way to look at it. Anyway, no more preaching on that at this point, but what we're going to do is sort of move into the idea of a COVID compliance officer. This is an idea that Nuala has been developing, and it's born partly out of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So I'm going to turn it over to Nuala to talk about what a COVID compliance officer is, whether you should have one, and what their role might look like.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So good morning again, everyone. The notion of a COVID compliance officer really came out of the movie industry. Because the movie industry was really so paralyzed by COVID, as you can imagine. Sets are crowded. Real estate is at a premium, so normally sets are very, very small. So there's a lot of interaction with human beings. Because you're acting, you can't have a mask on your face. And all the other people that are associated with it, all the camera people, the lighting people, the production crew, all of those people are exposed to, you know, the actors that won't have masks on and so forth. So the movie industry, of course, is very novel in its thinking and creative and want to continue making money. So what they have invented was, what if we bring in real compliance? What if we bring in real strict compliance on sets? And then we don't have, I think, maybe you recall Tom Cruise just went bananas, I think on a set in Italy, and it was captured on, you know, here I am telling you about good news sources. I think People and Us Weekly captured it, but Tom Cruise just really exploded at, I don't know if it was production crew or whatever, and about them not complying with masks. So I think you were starting to see, you know, Hollywood saying, and all movie industry saying, we can't make money. We can't produce this film unless there's compliance. So that's where it was born from. And the idea is that you'd have an individual on staff whose duties were to ensure compliance with the COVID precautions. I think what's happened organically in most workplaces, in Ontario anyways, is that someone has just sort of assumed those roles. So for example, in our office manager has kind of assumed those roles. She's doing the screening questions in the morning. She's the one that, you know, if you say, I think I have this symptom, do you think I should get a COVID test? And she stays up on that and makes sure that everybody is compliant, that they're socially distant. Whenever a precaution changes and they're saying, you know, she was the one that advanced the idea of having, I'm in Mia's private office right now, but in all the common areas, there's plexiglass to separate the staff from one another. And we've got assigned rooms for meeting with clients and so forth. So I think if you look at every workplace, someone or maybe some group of people have kind of assumed those roles, which is great. But it's very hard on those people that are doing that compliance. It's hard because it expands their duties. It's also hard because they're put in the role of police officer. And it's here we have a relatively small office, but some of you have pretty large staff complements. And that person that's in charge of ensuring the precautions are met will deal with all the stuff we've talked about. People that don't want to wear a mask, people that, you know, I feel oddly, one of the things that we saw throughout this year when we were dealing with various municipalities was, and other employers too, was people saying, I felt sick, but I'm not telling my employer because I don't want to be off for 14 days and I'm on a sick time. And, you know, trying to kind of skirt around it, you know, with their heads in the sand about whether or not they possibly had COVID. So these are the kind of sticky situations that the manager who's in charge of COVID compliance has to face. So my personal view, and also I guess my legal view, is it's not really fair to just thrust that upon a person in addition to all of their other duties. In unionized environments, there's going to be a question as to whether or not that is unionized work or it should be managerial work. And it's onerous because on top of the interpersonal garbage that you have to put up with from time to time, and on top of people trying to, you know, do these little slippery tricks in and out about whether or not they should be tested, which is enough, you also have an obligation to stay current with what the science is saying, what the local health unit is saying, what, you know, for example, here, I think we went through 3 different variations of the screening questions just to keep up. And it was our office manager who was on top of it saying, no, we got to change it. It's got to be more. And it's a tough role. So the modeling is similar to that the movie industry has picked up. And the thought is that if employers retained a COVID compliance officer, that person would be responsible for all of that, making sure that the screening questions are asked of staff every morning. What if they're not answered? You know, how can you retain the answer from someone else? Can you actually approach the employee and say, we need this answer, or you can't enter the workplace? Making sure that people are properly masked when they're in public, making sure that the social distancing takes place, making sure that there's plexiglass. And I think what we're going to see is and Paul and I are going to have I think a more fulsome conversation about this in a bit, but I think we're going to see some of the consequences of this pandemic will be, maybe we should be more cautious in view of all communicable diseases. Maybe we need to be more aware of that, period. So maybe a COVID compliance officer will turn into a healthy workplace compliance officer eventually. But at the moment, anyways, the model would be that a person would actually be retained by the employer, and that would be the person's job. So the policing of it, the obligation to stay current and disseminate that information, if new information comes in, to provide it. And then I think really with pandemic, probably the most important thing isn't new information. It's old information. I know we spoke about this on a session early on, that compliance fatigue. That people are just, I don't want to wash my hands for 20 seconds. I don't want, this mask is itchy. And I know we did a session on proper mask wearing, and I'm not going to say who, but someone on our team wore a mask from a car floor. So that's probably not in compliance. But I'll leave it to the audience to discern who that may have been, that devil may care staff person. But it's very important, I think, to go back and remind people about, the virus isn't gone. The vaccine is coming. It's slowly being rolled out. It's not being rolled out without hiccups. There's people that don't want it. But the virus is still here. So the part of the compliance officer's job would be to go back and say, on Thursday, we're doing a 10-minute webinar on hand washing, on, whatever, just little reminders. And there is a view that if you're giving the same old messaging in a different manner, you get people's attention. So if you've got, I noticed here, I think at every sink in this building, there's a sign about how to wash your hands. So much so that now we don't see those signs anymore. So it's probably time to change that, to have it in a different place, different color, have a little blurb go out to your staff during work. All of those kind of inventive ways of messaging, that would fall to your compliance officer. So it's something to consider. It's something that you'd be able to point to in the likely, I'm going to say, event that Ministry of Labor starts sniffing around to say, what are you doing to ensure compliance? It's not, be clear, it's not required in the legislation. It's over and above, but it might be something to consider. And we're looking here at starting to package together a training module for compliance officers so that they would know what the science is, they would know how to message, they would know how to, another very important component of the position would be the collection, retention, dissemination where allowed, and destruction of these records. We talked about that in the past, how important it is, because even when you're asking those little questions in the morning, do you have a scratchy throat, or do you have a temperature? That's medical information, so it's personal, and it has to be properly, and it might be nice for, especially some of the bigger employers, to say, here's all the personal information I have about, my staff and their SIN numbers, but this credenza, this is COVID. This is all COVID. So it's kind of, maybe it could be kept separate because it applies to all staff. So it's something that we're working on. We're definitely going to advance it here because we're excited about it. And we think it's going to be a great package for employers. But I urge you to think about it yourselves. Maybe if it seems like something that would be a good fit for you, to start maybe planting some seeds with council so they start thinking along those ways. But if you do none of that, circle back to the person or people that are in charge of the compliance now. And if nothing else, they need a hearty thank you, because that is a thankless job, and it is literally keeping us healthy. They're stringent compliance to the precautions. And when they're doing that, when they're checking the questionnaires in the morning, when they're ordering plexiglass, they're not doing their day job, and they still have to do their day job. So it's a very, very important role that I suspect everyone has someone. Maybe you're that someone. Maybe the people we're talking to today are that someone. But it's a hefty duty. So those are my comments on COVID compliance officers.
I'm going to add to that a little bit. Any of you who have had me in front of your council have probably heard me say, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And I really think that the COVID compliance officer is something that should get some attention in all employer organizations. But equally, it's important for the compliance officer or the people setting the program to ensure that there are documents about fulfilling that role. So you want to document that the sanitization has been done. You want to document that training has been done. You want to document that signs have been put up and they're checked periodically because sometimes they fall down or they're defaced. All of those documents are what will help you in the event that you're defending some sort of legal action brought as a result of a COVID outbreak or a COVID related casualty in your organization. So those documents are fairly cheap insurance. So as important as actually doing these things is documenting that you've done them. Okay, so there is a question, and I guess it's going to go to Tim and perhaps to Nuala. So the question is, would a vaccine passport be required for travel between provinces? And do we see that the provincial or federal governments are likely to make vaccines mandatory for municipal employees? What are your thoughts on that question, Tim?
Yeah, so with respect to the mandatory vaccinations in terms of legislation for municipal employees, I believe there was legislation tabled at a point in the past, and it was defeated, about mandatory vaccinations in general across the country. I'm not aware of any legislation on the horizon that would apply specifically to municipal employees, and so I'd say the likelihood of that is probably fairly low, but I'm not sure. Regarding the community passport between the provinces, you know, that one I'm actually curious to get Nuala's thoughts. I'm not sure. That is something that I'm curious to get anybody else's thoughts on as well.
I think the problem with that is that there isn't any infrastructure at the provincial borders to try to enforce that. And I don't see that the resources are going to be spent to create border crossing facilities in between provinces. So I don't think that's likely to come up. And I also don't really think that the provincial or federal government are going to step into making vaccines mandatory for municipalities, particularly when you look at the recent federal effort with respect to handguns, where they were trying to delegate down to the municipalities the decision about whether or not to make handguns illegal in the municipality. So I think those levels of government are really looking to defer or delegate down this kind of responsibility. So I think it's something that in our municipalities, council is going to have to deal with. Could be that the province does take a go at this. I don't think you're going to see it federally, but we don't have any information that it's on the horizon. So on that note, Nuala and I are now going to talk about developing community leadership. So we have spent the last year thinking about and dealing with COVID in our community. We have seen a lot of councils that have spent a lot of time over the last year looking inward into the organization, looking at staff, how staff are performing, really focusing inward, if I can use that term. And we think that right now is a fantastic opportunity for council to really focus on success and lessons and leadership in the community. We think it's, as the pandemic is hopefully winding down, we see this as a real time that communities need leadership from council. And so we have a bunch of ideas about how to do that. One that that Peggy Young-Lovelace and I talk about a lot in our trainings is the idea of a council term plan. The concept is we've got a year and a half until the next election. And the council term plan is an activity for council to sit down and say, okay, we've got this much time left. What are we going to do? What are we going to promise our ratepayers that we're going to do as a council to move our municipality forward? It's a fantastic tool to demonstrate leadership. It's a fantastic tool to bring the council leadership team and the senior management team together to put your minds to what we're going to do in the remaining time, which really there's not a lot of time left, but there is a fantastic opportunity right now, because one thing COVID has done universally is change our life and change the way we work and change the way particularly our municipality provides services or things or service really to our ratepayers. So I am strongly recommending, if you don't have a council term plan, that go on the agenda and that council spend some time right away to decide what they're going to do with the remaining time, which will demonstrate to the community leadership and proactive work in the community. Nuala's also got some great ideas about ways to emphasize the positive things that have happened during the pandemic. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Nuala to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's such a massive topic, really. We could go in so many different directions, but you know, as we were preparing for this, I'm reminded of when one of my daughters was little and she had a cold or flu and went to the pediatrician, and then she got an antibiotic, and she was better, but she still seemed kind of not herself. And I went back to the pediatrician and he said, sometimes when little ones are sick for a period like that, they forget how to be happy. You got to kind of remind them how to be happy. And it was true. And I think as a people, we've kind of forgotten how to be happy. We've had this mist of pandemic floating over our heads, literally and figuratively, for over a year now. People are unable to see loved ones. You see an old friend and you can't hug them. It's just weird. And things that normally bring us a lot of pleasure, like travel, very, very restricted. However, one thing about human beings, especially as a group, is we're an incredibly resilient species. And I urge everyone to draw on that resilience now. And specifically what I think is important to do is rear view mirror gaze a little bit. Look what has happened and consider what we might distill out of the precautions, the way we've operated, the way we've treated one another, and personnel and employment concerns, how that unfolded during the past year, and what is valuable from that. So, for example, Paul said early on that he has a colleague in Toronto, a lawyer in Toronto, very big law firm, and they were looking at expanding space. They were going to buy, and I mean, the cost of real estate in Toronto, of course, is astronomical. And with the pandemic, they've thought better of it. And they've decided, actually, this remote thing is working very well. So certainly remote work is one of the things that I think we should try and braid into our employment workplaces going forward. It's very valuable for anybody with, you know, mobility issues. It's valuable for people that, you know, are in a care giving role, whether to elderly parents or spouses or children. It's very valuable for that. Things like, I remember one workplace thing that used to come up a lot. There was one at one municipality. They had a personal day. I think it was that staff could take as a personal day that was sort of included in your vacation bank. And it brought so many issues because people were saying, I don't need the day. I just need 2 hours because Leon's is delivering my fridge. I can come back. No, it's got to be a day. So with remote work, things like that, like deliveries that we need done, or if there's going to be a repair person coming to your house, you're still working. So I think we've all learned the value of remote work, and I urge you to consider ways to continue that into the future. Conversely, for a lot of people, working remotely meant working at home, and if home is disruptive for any host of reasons, you know, relationship wise, just the actual environment isn't conducive to a workplace. There's something, then it became really a struggle for those people, continues to be a struggle for those people who do not have the best setting for whatever reason. I think it's important for us to look at that and see what we could do to assist if we are maintaining remote work going forward. And on an earlier, I almost said on an earlier broadcast, on an earlier webinar, I said, if you're telling people to work from home, then you need to outfit them. And that means with ergonomic furniture and laptops and cell phones and, you know, cameras if they're doing Zoom and all of that. So I think that's got to be a component to it, but we need to at least start to be aware of not everybody goes home to June Cleaver's life and they can sit quietly and work. In fact, no one goes home to that. So everyone has got some sort of struggle on it. So sort of those two components that are sort of competing, I think we should look at. And then drilling down to staff again, as I just said, I'm sure every workplace, I'm sure everybody I'm speaking to today has someone, or maybe you are the someone that's been in charge of COVID compliance. So just as there's been that type of onerous work, it's been a tough time to work, period. It's very difficult to conduct a meeting. I find it particularly difficult to conduct a meeting over something kind of sensitive. Some workplace matters that we've been involved in are kind of sensitive, and it just feels very foreign to be speaking into a computer screen. So it's taken a toll on all of us and on all of our staff. And I think it's very important to recognize the hard work that people have gone through, even just, and for yourselves. Actually, that was the whole purpose of our webinar today. Really, we wanted to say how proud we are of you for coming through, for some of the creative things we heard about, for the compassionate approaches you took, for your endurance. And I will say, as a former municipal employee, you are not well paid. It's a labor of love. It's the amount of dedication and commitment that we saw. It really made me proud of community leaders that you all are. And I would sing that song to your staff also. And then the final piece I would say is I continue that chorus out to the community, because so many of us heard such beautiful stories. And I think it started, one of the things that first made me sort of appreciate the human spirit, I guess, was when you see those birthday cars where they would drive by somebody's house with balloons and just to say happy birthday to a child, or I guess in this case, Peggy Greco, right? But it was very sweet that we started doing that as people, saying that my kid's not having a graduation, my daughter's not having her birthday. That's absolutely happening. So those little ideas, and I've heard about people, picking up groceries. Peter Kenyon was talking about some of the sweet things that people had done just in their community. I think we should start looking as communities, and not just with staff, but out to the bigger community, of these small unsung heroes that have done very beautiful, considerate things for people during such a terribly strife-riven time for humanity. And what got us through, and what is continuing to get us through, really is that kindness that we see in our community. So if you can think of, a hero cookie program that you could kind of sell to council, if you have good relations with your local media, that they could highlight somebody. They're good news stories. They make us all feel hopeful. And that mist of that low-grade depression, that's real. I mean, that's impacting it. And then saying that my sister often says to me, and I just love it, is you only need one match in a dark cave for there to be light. Just need one match. The cave can be huge, but you'll see. So that's what we need, that kind of, I think, community compassion, empathy for others, that will literally light the way for us out of this and into the future.
And to build on that, I think that there's actually a concrete step that councils can take, and it builds on Peter Kenyon's idea of asset mapping. And I think this is a great opportunity for council to discuss at a council meeting all of the positive that they're aware of, in the community and make a list of what those were and who did those, because those people are community leaders. They are assets that you have in the community that don't require and did not require provincial government funding or grants or things like that. So these are assets that you actually have in every one of our communities that you can leverage in the future. And probably the cost to the community of leveraging that is going to be some recognition for the work that they did do, because they didn't do it for any money. So that exists, and I think council should take this opportunity to grab and capitalize on those assets that exist in your community. So that's what we had to say about community leadership. Additionally, I think it's in the same meeting or in a subsequent meeting, and it might be something for a committee to look at, is over the past year, as we've had this pandemic, what worked really well. Make a list of those things and don't lose them when everybody's vaccinated and we go back to normal. If we can identify things that worked really well, let's continue those and build them and figure out how we can leverage that into the future. Additionally, not everything worked really well. So let's be honest and look at what did not work well and what do we want to avoid? What from this opportunity can we change and fix and repair and make sure that we don't repeat it next time there's an event like this, which may be only a local event, but if you've done the debrief and you've done the analysis, then you're better prepared for a problem in the future. So we think those are things that council really should be looking at now while we are in this point in time. And frankly, because of the pandemic, it's really easy for workplaces to change and capitalize on the crisis. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Mia now to give us some current tips and reminders for your municipalities. And again, we're happy to take questions.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Really happy to see everybody here. What I kind of want to do today is give a recap of the last year and what we've seen. So I think we can all agree that this was a threat that we certainly didn't see coming and never anticipated that this was a journey that municipalities would have to go on. Everything happened very, very quickly. Municipalities had to respond by assembling their teams, deciding on what the responsibilities of those teams were. And then I think the biggest change that we saw was working remotely. Not only was this a change, but it was also a challenge. Also at this time, we had to think about continuing services for the municipality. What was that going to look like? What would have to be altered? Were we going to eliminate some services? Were we going to continue? What was that going to look like? And that all had to be decided very, very quickly. We were experiencing announcement after announcement from the provincial government, and things were changing rapidly, and municipalities had to adapt to that. There was the closing of facilities, limited access to resources. March break was happening, it was extended, and then the students never ended up going back to school. Then we had the electronic participation of council, and that was a time when we really, really, really had to embrace technology to conduct public business. And I think we can all agree that when we look back on this, it was really, really surreal how quickly municipalities had to come together and act quickly and did it so well and quite seamlessly from what I've heard and the stories that I've heard. It went very, very well. So I think that's something that everybody should be very, very proud of. You know, now we think about what the future is going to look like. Are we still going to have hybrid meetings in the future? You know, and how has this been for the public as well? How has their experience been with, you know, instead of going to City Hall and attending a council meeting, now having to attend remotely? So there's also that aspect as well that we have to consider moving forward. We also had to think about how this public decision-making was going to happen. In the beginning, it was remote participation. Okay, well, you know, is this allowed? Is it only under certain circumstances? What kind of restrictions are we going to have now? Because at one point when we were in lockdown, nobody could go anywhere. So I think that it's really important to look back on that and see the lessons that we've learned. We experienced, of course, budget pressures and so on. So this was an emergency that we didn't see coming, and it certainly highlighted a lot of vulnerabilities as well, which is something that it's not a bad thing because you can learn and grow from it, which everybody did. It also highlighted and contemplated emergency plans that may have thought about something like this happening, but never to the extent that we experienced. So it was also an opportunity to, you know, think about training with respect to emergency response plans, and understanding and maybe changing roles and responsibilities based on what we've learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, and then how to put things in motion quickly, also while being adaptable to what was going on, because like I said, things were rapidly changing. I think too, it's really important to think of the how this has affected mental health, and the impact of COVID-19 has kind of prolonged this state of crisis and how everybody is feeling around us. So this is so important. A lot of organizations stepped up their resources to support those that were in need. And as we transition, going back to what our normal may be, that's also going to be a challenge. So it was really great to see the mental health resources that became available to assist those that needed the assistance. So the importance of teams working together and relying on one another is still very, very important. Communication and sharing information as well. That's one of the things that's going to really help everybody move forward from this. And there is the light at the end of the tunnel. We're seeing a lot of new things coming. There's a lot of hope. There's a lot of positivity with the vaccine now. I think a year into this, we can now say that we've got some hope of where this is going. And throughout all my tips and tricks, I've always maintained the thought of looking back to see how far we've come and what we've learned and how we're going to use that in the future. Resiliency has been definitely something that's common that we've seen among all municipalities. It's been amazing. And one important thing to remember is communication is still key. Maintain communication all the time. Engage your community and continue to plan for recovery in the future. So those are my tips and tricks, and I hope everybody enjoyed them.
Thanks, Mia. So we have a question, and I'm going to hand the answer over to Tim. The question is, if a municipality was to put in place a proof of vaccine policy prior to entry to facilities, how would we handle, the question is Mennonites, but it could be any sort of cultural group, who we understand are not in favor of vaccines, but request meetings with staff or council or otherwise access the municipal facilities. So I'll hand it over to you, Tim. And first, unmute yourself. There.
Well, yeah, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Vicky. That's actually a really good question, because it touches on some of the things with that we talked about with mandatory vaccination policies themselves, and that is that there are going to be people, whether they're specific groups of people who have perhaps a religious reason for not getting a vaccination, or that are otherwise unable to. I believe there's some screening that happens prior to getting the vaccine, and certain allergies, etc., can actually result in someone not being able to get the vaccine. And so there are going to be individuals who come forward who are not able to, for various reasons, get the vaccine. I don't think that there's a way to have a blanket approach to say you can't enter the facility just because you don't have the vaccine, or you can't have access to municipal staff, I think it would be handled fairly similarly to how we did with and are continuing to do with masks. There are some people who have various reasons, respiratory, etc., that they can't wear masks. Businesses are, of course, wanting people to wear masks, but can't discriminate against those who are unable to. So I think in general it would be handled very similar to that. Of course, you want to protect your staff, and so you have to devise, I suppose, a way. You have a duty to maintain a safe workplace. Some staff might be uncomfortable dealing with someone in that capacity, and so I think you'd have to come up with a solution that involved perhaps mask wearing for those people, perhaps making sure there were other preventative measures that were taken while staff was interacting with them. I think it's going to come down to what guidelines. Hopefully, some guidelines come from Algonquin Public Health and other public health organizations on how to deal with that. But I think preventative measures and making sure that being aware that discrimination and human rights legislation is going to play a role in that.
I agree with you 100%, Tim, and I think you've kind of hit a really good solution on the head, and that would be for you to call your public health unit and say, look, we have this issue that we have to deal with. What are your recommendations and advice? Because I think you're right, Tim, that there will be situations where you have to accommodate this type of religious-based reluctance to get the vaccine. And I think that the social distancing measures that we have are going to remain in place for people who can't prove that they have a vaccine. And so you're going to need to ensure distancing, you're going to need to ensure masking and guarding and sanitization, things like that. So that's my thought on that. Vicky, I hope that's helped you. All right, so there we are. That is our hour. Thank you. Sorry, Tim, did you have something else?
No, I agree with everything you said, Paul, and yeah, I think the best advice in that situation is contact your local health unit and ask them how you can best protect your staff in those circumstances.
And document that discussion. So thank you all so much for coming. A big congratulations for making it through a year of the pandemic. Remember when we first started this, we were locked down for 2 weeks. It's been a long 2 weeks, but congratulations. Thanks so much to all of you. We're certainly here for you. If you have any questions, if we can be of service, our Wishart Municipal Law Group loves to work with municipalities, and we would love to work with yours. So please give us a call. Thanks very much for attending. Take care. Have a good day.
One more thing. I think you forget, Paul, or you're in denial.
I'm in denial.
He's in denial. So the WLG, is that it? No, that's a different one. WMG, that's us.
You've heard it.
Is getting a little smaller. And I've accepted a position with the local legal clinic. So with a very heavy heart for my good friends and colleagues and my outstanding clients that I've had the pleasure and honor of working with. Today's my last day at Wishart. I hope to stay in touch with as many of you as I possibly could. It was truly an honor to work with you. And in my career, I haven't met as many smart, dedicated, interesting lawyers as the group that you have at Wishart. You're in very, very good hands, and it was my distinct pleasure to work with them and with you.
And so I guess I'm forced to say goodbye, but oftentimes when people leave here, they come back. So we're Wishart Municipal Group and the Hotel California rolled up in one. So hopefully we'll see Nuala back on a webinar like this in the near future, but congratulations on your opportunity. Thank you very much to everyone. Take care.